He turned a legacy biscuit company into a billion-dollar powerhouse. Under his watch, Britannia went from a company battling irrelevance to one of India's most admired consumer businesses. Leaner, sharper, and a far more profitable company. Varun Berry spent over a decade as managing director and the vice chairman of Britannia Industries, driving one of the most remarkable corporate transformations Indian FMCG has seen in recent memory. Before Britannia, he built his consumer instincts across PepsiCo, where he spent nearly 2 decades understanding what moves Indian palates and Indian wallets. Today, he joins us on the interview to talk brands, consumption, and what it really takes to build something that lasts. Varun Berry, welcome to ET Now. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Aisha. Lovely to be here with you.
Right. Varun, I have to draw it back to Britannia, right? The time when the operating margins moved from roughly 5% when you took over to close to 16% at their peak under your leadership. Tell me, that kind of structural shift doesn't happen by accident. When you look back, what was the single biggest mindset change internally within the organization that made that transformation possible?
I think it was the team coming together and working on various parameters. It wasn't just one thing that made the change. The biggest change that we brought was, the brands that we had power in them. So making sure that we strengthened those brands. The distribution strength, we had great distribution, but it was a little transactional. So we had to make sure that we made that stronger. Consistent innovation behind the brands that we had. A very much superior consumer understanding of who the brands were going to, the connection with our consumers, why were the consumers buying us, and how do we get them to consume us more? Pricing power. Pricing was a lever that we used to use, indiscriminately to improve profitability. We started to think of pricing as the last lever to use, but we made sure that our brands had the pricing power to be able to, charge a premium over competition. And obviously category leadership, which, provides that power in the marketplace for brands to move faster. And finally, the most important was the talent and the culture that we built at the company, which was a very critical element. We got people from within the organization to rise to bigger jobs, which gave them the satisfaction that we are not bringing people from outside. We are getting these guys to get better opportunities. And, we made sure that they not just did their job, but we, taught them how to do their jobs, etc. So I think those were the elements. And obviously, one thing that we did really well was finding opportunities for cost savings. And we took a target of a 2% cost saving every year. And that was a philosophy that was built across the team. And that was what, helped us get from the low profitability to the high profitability that you talk about.
But Varun, when you look at the arc of Indian consumption across your career, from PepsiCo years to Britannia decade, what were the 1 or 2 big shifts in consumer behavior that genuinely surprised you, things you did not see coming and had to course correct around?
Well, that's a great question. One thing that I saw clearly through the years, the brand loyalty that consumers had to one brand, it wasn't like it went away, but the consumers, I would say in the 90s, a consumer would, stick to one brand throughout their consumption of that particular category. From that, it moved to creating a repertoire of brands, right? So while their favored brand was obviously consumed, the maximum number of times, but there was a repertoire of brands, and the consumers became more flirtatious with brands. They would want to try new brands, and this was not just an urban phenomena. This was a rural phenomena as well. The aspirations of a urban consumer and a rural consumer became almost the same. They wanted to try new brands. If they liked them, they would consume them. Let's say a consumer eats a biscuit, let's say 8 or 10 times in a month, right? The big brand would still be 3 or 4 times out of that, but they would flirt and consume other brands for those, other 4 or 5 occasions that they had during the month. And that gave, upstart brands, smaller brands, the opportunity to prove themselves to the consumers. If they were really good, the consumers would, move from consuming it once to twice to thrice, etc. So that was the biggest change that I saw. The consumer loyalty stayed, but the repertoire and the flirtatious nature of consumers with new brands took a new definition.
Quite interesting. But tell me, what separates great consumer companies from merely good ones over long periods of time? I mean, Britannia, Unilever, Nestle have all compounded wealth and relevance across decades. What is the one common thread, you think? And what is the one thing that most companies get wrong in trying to replicate that?
See, the fundamentals, Aisha, are the same, right? It's about brand power, it's about distribution, it's about making sure that you have innovation pipelines, it's about a superior consumer understanding. All of those fundamentals are the same. What's really changed is the nimble-footed behavior that consumer companies are showing, right? There are some companies which are slow and slothy about how they move forward. And there are some companies which are taking on lessons from, the new upstarts that do, 5 innovations a month. It's not about doing innovations. It's also about the fundamental changes that you make to your business depending on the conditions that exist in the country. And the companies that are great companies have become very fast off their foot. They move quickly, they are nimble, and while the fundamentals of the business remain the same, they move towards getting to what they want to in a much faster and a quicker way.
But Varun, just taking a leaf from what you said earlier about the Indian consumer, the consumer today is being described simultaneously as more aspirational and more value conscious, which sounds like a bit of a contradiction perhaps. How do you read this duality, if I can call it that, and how should FMCG companies be positioning themselves against that?
So, yeah, that's a tough one. Each category has a very different code, and each company needs to figure out how the code for their category works. And also, one needs to remember that with the e-com and quick com and all of that coming through, it's becoming very important for companies to protect the fundamentals of the business. Today, I would think if a company wants to start a business, they would do it with only e-com or quick com, and they would get access to at least the bigger towns, and get access to their products. And as I told you, the consumers are also flirtatious. They would try their products, and if they're good, they would stick with it. So the duality of having a strong company with a large pipe and a very large flow through it, and the nimble-footedness which is required to launch niche brands which deal with niche requirements for a smaller set of consumers. I think that duality becomes very, very important. And that's what companies need to address as they move forward.
But Varun, from your time at Britannia, you made a deliberate push into adjacencies, dairy, croissants, international geographies. In the hindsight, which of those bets do you think was the boldest, and which one would you have approached perhaps differently now as you look back?
See, I think I wouldn't change anything that I did, and I think the company continues to follow that path, and I wish them really the best. I think the area which which needs to be addressed from a consumer standpoint is health, right? And I do think that we did a lot in that area. But I think what is required today is, how does a company create a AI native health and preventive wellness brand, right? That's an area which, today, if you think about it, Aisha, you've got data on your iWatch, right? Your Apple Watch, you've got data on your, Aura Ring, you've got a whole lot of data which is available with every consumer. How do you mine that data, and how do you create a tailored solution for these consumers? And the company which cracks the code on that is going to be the long-term winner in this space.
Oh yeah, and especially the focus and thrust now on nutraceuticals, etc. There's so much knowledge about how we consume, what we consume, and what's good and what not. Definitely, that seems like a great opportunity. But I'll come to that in just a bit. What I also want to talk about is QCOM, like you said. That's fundamentally sort of disrupted the distribution mathematics itself that legacy FMCG companies, spent decades perhaps perfecting. Kirana networks, general trade, the entire go-to-market architecture is now being sort of stress tested. Does the traditional distribution moat still hold, or is it now slowly sort of becoming a liability?
No, it's certainly not a liability, but you're right. The strength of that moat is challenged, right? So while you need to protect that in a way that your markets where India is such a large country with so many villages, 600 and odd thousand villages, right? I don't think the e-com and the quick com can get to that. And mass companies which have products which cater to everyone in the country, to the smallest village in the country, will always have that as a moat. But that challenge of that moat being a very important moat in urban areas, in metros, etc., is has diminished for sure, right? So what has fundamentally changed is this moat is weak. However, and also the cost of testing your product has collapsed. You can test it for a very small price. You can just put it in e-com, quick com, and you can get very quick responses on how this becomes a successful product as you launch it across, right? And it's a situation where one has to take cognizance of the fact that the fundamentals are different today, and there are some brands which cater to the bottom of the pyramid, and there it's very important to make sure that your distribution stays absolutely intact. But as I was talking about these niche brands which are catering to a niche consumer base in in niche areas, I think there you really have to make sure that you take full advantage of this new channel which has emerged. And I don't think companies are doing enough of that. They're not doing that duality of one base of the pyramid, one absolute pinnacle of the pyramid, dealing with very, very different brands and dealing with them in a very different way. that duality is suffering in the large companies which are, focusing on churning out products from their factories, mass products, and getting to their traditional distribution channels, their traditional ways of marketing. I think that needs to change as you go forward.
But tell me, D2C brands, Varun, have raised hundreds of millions of dollars telling a story that FMCG companies, or rather legacy FMCG companies, are slow, bloated, disconnected from the modern consumer. How much of that critique you think is fair, and how much of it is a narrative that obscures the reality of building at scale and at margin?
No, it's absolutely true. There is a new playbook, Aisha. There is a new playbook which needs to be catered to. In this playbook, you start with a sharp point of view. You build an audience or community first, and then you use the D2C to own the relationship and the data, right? Once you have the data, you invest in earned and owned media more than paid, right? So it's a very different playbook, right? If you're not able to cater to this, right, you use retail very selectively for scale, right? It's just once you build a certain a certain threshold, then you start to say, okay, I will start to look at traditional retail as well, and then make the product and the marketing in such a way that it caters to that. I think that playbook, uh, if you are able to play to that, whether you're a small company or a large company, I think it will help you in building those niche brands. And if you don't, then you will be stuck with the mass brands and you will never get to be able to build brands which will compete with these upstarts.
So if you were taking over Britannia today, Varun, same company, same portfolio, but a 2026 context, what is the first thing you would do differently compared to when you actually walked in?
Actually, I would do nothing differently. The fundament,
I
the
knew you
fun-
would give a diplomatic answer. I was just trying my luck with this one.
no, frankly, I would not do anything differently. Yes, I would, whatever I've told you about the duality, I would focus on that because at that stage there was no e-com and quick com, etc. But the fundamentals are absolutely the same. And if you're not able to build your profitability, if you're not able to build your talent base, if you're not able to build your distribution and your brands, and if you're not able to get cost savings to the table, you can't do much. So fundamentally doing the same but with a view to where the market is today would be my playbook.
Varun, premiumization, that's the word every FMCG analyst reaches for when talking about the next growth chapter. But India still has hundreds of millions of consumers who are only just entering the formal consumption for the first time. Is the next decade really a premiumization story, or is there a risk that the industry is, taking to itself?
India is a premiumization story, and the reason for that, Aisha, is that the consumers, whether they are in the metro areas or they are in rural areas, whether they are SECA, which is the highest income category, or they are bottom of the pyramid, they are all looking for the next move in their lives. They're looking for products which are better than what they've been consuming yesterday. And that is the aspirational part of the Indian consumer. And hence, premiumization at every level is important. It's not just about, if you're selling 1,000 rupee per kilo product, you want to now make it 1,500 rupee per kilo product. No, that's not the point. How do you create premium experiences for every consumer in India? And that is the future of the consumer industry in India.
Interesting. The point that you made about AI, and that's clearly beginning to touch everything from demand forecasting to personalized marketing to supply chain optimization. Where do you think the FMCG sector is genuinely going to feel the impact of AI first? And where is the hype running ahead of reality?
Well, I don't think the hype is running ahead of reality. Reality is what it is today. There is so much data, and if you mine this properly, you are really cutting edge. So it's a reality. However, I do think that the consumer companies are, especially the larger ones, are not able to do what is necessary to be able to use this data in an effective way to take the consumers to a different level, the relationship with the consumers to a different level, right? And I do think that consumer companies are still learning on this front. But I do also think that if they don't learn fast, then whoever doesn't will be left behind. So this reality is something that every consumer company needs to pay heed to and work tirelessly to be able to, you know, get to the next level. Otherwise, this is going to become a competitive disadvantage.
So, if I were to ask Varun Berry today, if you were building a consumer company from scratch with no legacy constraints, which category would excite you most and would be the founding logic of that business?
Well, what I told you would be my area. I would certainly look at, building health, preventive health products, which can be AI based. I would genuinely look at that. And, that would be the area that would, make your product go a very, very long way. Um, and I do think that there are a few companies which are doing it, but not doing it well enough. I think it's an area which really requires a lot of attention. If you hear any of the podcasts, Aisha, everyone's talking about longevity. People are saying people are going to live 150 years, and that kind of stuff is being professed, right? Now, India has to take a lead, and the big companies have a definite advantage in making sure that they are able to, get better at that. So that is the area that I would look at.
Interesting. And after decades of watching brands rise, plateau, and sometimes fail, what is the one lesson about consumers and brands that you believe remains completely timeless, regardless of what technology does to it and the world around it?
Well, the fundamentals, as I said, absolutely remain the same, right? You are building a relationship with the consumer, and when you are building a brand and you are going to the market, you've got to think of a few things before you get there. Why will the consumer buy me? First of all, who am I, right? As a brand, who am I? Why will the consumer buy me? And why am I different from any other product which is in my category? I think those fundamentals are absolutely the same. It's just that today the convergence of the high fidelity data that we have with whatever brands that we are building needs to be much, much stronger than what it was any time in the past. And also making sure that you move from insights, we used to do insights, to real intervention as you go and build your brands. I think those are the few things which I would focus on, and I think otherwise the fundamentals are about the same as what they were 30 years ago.
Right, Varun Berry, from $1 billion turnarounds to the quiet but relentless work of making, a brand matter to a billion people. You've clearly seen the Indian consumption from the inside at every altitude. One can safely say that. And you know what really stands out from this conversation today is not just the strategic clarity, but the conviction that great brands are ultimately built on not just great discipline, but in product, in purpose, patience, and more importantly in today's time, agility and moving ahead with the times. It's been a privilege today having you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aisha.
Thanks.